Good morning. This is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. In the Gospel of Luke, in Jesus' Sermon on the Plain, Jesus said this to the disciples and to the multitudes who were listening to him. He said, "Blessed are you when people hate you and exclude you and revile you and defame you on account of the Son of Man. Rejoice on that day and leap for joy, because surely your reward is great in heaven, for that is what your ancestors did to the prophets." Well, I don't know about you, but for me, those words are not easy to embrace. Rejoice in being hated and excluded and defiled and defamed. This is a blessing? Well, yes, it can be. And the story of Ruby Bridges reveals just how that can be the case. Ruby Bridges was a 6-year-old girl back in 1960. She was the first Black child to attend France Elementary School. Every day she was escorted into the school by federal marshals because the city and state police refused to protect her. And every morning and afternoon, she had to walk through a gauntlet, a mob of white people who were screaming obscenities, yelling threats, and waving their fists at her. And once she arrived inside the school, she spent the day all alone because none of the white parents would let their children go to school with Ruby. Robert Coles was a young Air Force psychiatrist at the time, and he just happened to be driving through New Orleans as the protest erupted. He stopped and watched the scene unfold and started asking around. He discovered that Ruby ran this gauntlet every day. Well, as he watched the scene unfold, it occurred to him that Ruby would make an excellent subject for studying the effects of stress on children. Well, it took him some time to earn the trust of the family because no white person had ever even set foot inside their home. But Ruby agreed to participate, and whenever they ran out of things to say, Coles asked her to draw pictures. And over the next months, an astonishing thing happened. The roles began to reverse. Coles, who was the psychiatrist, the expert, the graduate of Harvard and Columbia and the University of Chicago, had come to treat this uneducated, disadvantaged Black child from a poor neighborhood in New Orleans. But as time passed, Coles felt the roles being reversed. He was becoming the student, and she was becoming the teacher. She was teaching him how to live an ethical, loving, and meaningful life. At night, whenever he had interviewed Ruby that day, Coles talked to his wife, Jane, about Ruby and about her situation. He wondered what would he do if it were him, if he were in that same situation. And he said he'd call the police, but Ruby couldn't do that because the local police wouldn't protect her. And then he thought he'd call his lawyer and get a court order. But Ruby and her family didn't know any lawyers, and they couldn't afford one anyway. And then he thought that he'd rise above the mob by explaining their behavior psychologically, and he'd probably write an angry letter to the editor. But Ruby couldn't do that. She was only 6. She was just learning to read and write. So how did she do it? How did she endure such an ugly, awful abuse, verbal abuse, each day? Well, one day he asked her, and Ruby told him that she prayed. She prayed for herself, that she would be strong and unafraid. And she also prayed for her enemies, that God would forgive them. And then she said this: Jesus prayed that on the cross. Forgive them, because they don't know what they're doing. What a blessing. What a blessing to know already as a 6-year-old child the power of praying for your enemies and forgiving those who persecute you. What a blessing to know at such an early age that darkness cannot drive out darkness, but light can. that hatred cannot drive out hatred, but love can, that evil cannot drive out evil, but goodness can, that sin cannot drive out sin, but forgiveness can. Ruby, you were, and you still are, blessed.